The scrap bucket rattled against David Reed's leg as he walked through the empty streets. Most people were already at work or busy with their morning routines, which suited him just fine. He preferred the quiet hours when nobody bothered to stare or whisper behind his back. David turned into the old industrial zone where rusted machinery sat abandoned between half-finished buildings. The colony planners had big dreams for this area once, but those dreams died when the funding ran out. Now it served as home to creatures that most humans considered nothing more than pests. A soft chittering sound came from behind a broken conveyor belt. David smiled and set down his bucket. 3 small fox-like animals emerged from the shadows, their silver fur catching the morning light. Their large eyes watched him carefully but without fear. These were Nibari, though most colonists just called them vermin. "Good morning, little ones," David said quietly. He pulled out chunks of leftover bread and synthetic protein from his bucket. The creatures approached slowly, their movements graceful despite their obvious hunger. David had been coming here for 8 months now. At first, the Nibari had scattered whenever they saw him. But patience won them over. Now they waited for him each day, and some even allowed him to scratch behind their ears. The largest of the 3, which David privately called Patch because of a dark mark on its forehead, made a series of clicking sounds. The other 2 responded with their own clicks and whistles. David had noticed these vocalizations followed patterns, almost like they were talking to each other. "I know you understand more than people think," David told them as they ate. "You just need someone to give you a chance." His former colleagues at the colony maintenance department thought he was crazy. Feeding animals was pointless, they said. Waste of good food that could go to humans. But David saw intelligence in those large eyes. He saw fear, hope, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The sound of approaching footsteps made all 3 Nibari freeze. David turned to see Helen Cross, one of the security officers, walking toward them. The Nibari scattered immediately, disappearing into the maze of abandoned equipment. "David," Helen said with a sigh, "you know people are talking about what you do here." "Let them talk," David replied, standing up and dusting off his knees. "I'm not hurting anyone. Administrator Wilson doesn't see it that way. He says you're encouraging pest population growth, making the problem worse for everyone." David had heard this argument before. Wilson ran the colony with an iron fist and zero tolerance for anything he considered disruptive. The Nibari were just one more problem to be eliminated in his view. "These creatures were here first, Helen. We came to their world and destroyed their food sources when we terraformed this area. The least we can do is make sure they don't starve." Helen looked uncomfortable. She was one of the few people who didn't openly mock David's daily routine. But she also couldn't openly support it. Her job depended on following Wilson's rules. "Just be careful," she said finally. "Wilson's been asking questions about who's been leaving food scraps around. If he connects it to you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. Wilson had already fired him from his maintenance job 6 months ago for refusing to help set poison traps for the Nibari. Another black mark on his record could mean losing his housing permit or even deportation from the colony. After Helen left, David waited several minutes before calling softly to the hidden creatures. Patch emerged first, followed by the other 2. They seemed to understand that the danger had passed. "Don't worry about her," David told them. "Helen's not the problem. She's just trying to do her job." He finished distributing the food and sat on a nearby crate to watch them eat. The Nibari had developed a sharing system where the larger ones made sure the smaller ones got enough food first. David had never seen wild animals behave this way. It suggested social rules and cooperation that went far beyond simple survival instincts. A movement in the distance caught his attention. More Nibari were watching from various hiding spots throughout the industrial zone. David counted at least a dozen, though he suspected there were many more. Word had spread through their community about the human who brought food without trying to hurt them. The irony wasn't lost on David. He had become an outcast among his own, kind for showing kindness to creatures that others refused to understand. But here in this forgotten corner of the colony, he had found acceptance from beings that most humans considered mindless pests. As the 3 Nibari finished eating, Patch approached David's leg and gently rubbed against it, much like a cat might do. The gesture was unmistakably affectionate. David reached down and carefully scratched the creature's head, earning a pleased purring sound. "You're welcome," David said. Same time tomorrow? Patch made a series of clicks that David chose to interpret as agreement. All three creatures retreated to their hiding spots, but their eyes remained visible, watching as David packed up his empty bucket. The walk back to his small apartment took him through the main residential area where other colonists were beginning their daily activities. David kept his head down and tried to ignore the pointed stares and hushed conversations that followed him. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 doors down from him, made no effort to hide her disapproval. "Waste of good food," she muttered loudly as he passed. "Those things are nothing but disease-carrying vermin." David didn't respond. He had learned that defending the Nabari only made people more convinced that he was unstable. Better to let them think what they wanted and continue doing what he knew was right. Back in his apartment, David cleaned the empty food bucket and prepared for another day of job hunting. His savings were running low and he needed work soon. But no matter how desperate things got, he wouldn't stop his daily visits to the industrial zone. The Nabari depended on him now and he wouldn't let them down. Through his small window, David could see the towers of the colony's main district gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere in those buildings, Administrator Wilson was probably planning new ways to deal with the pest problem. But David had made his choice. He would stand with the creatures that others abandoned, no matter what it cost him. 3 weeks had passed since Administrator Wilson posted the new regulations throughout the colony. Large warning signs now decorated every public building, declaring that feeding unauthorized wildlife was punishable by hefty fines and possible imprisonment. David read them each time he passed, but his daily routine never changed. The industrial zone had become more dangerous for his visits. Security patrols had increased, and David found himself taking longer routes through forgotten maintenance tunnels to avoid detection. The Nubari seemed to sense the increased tension too. They stayed hidden longer and startled at every unfamiliar sound. "I'm sorry this is harder now," David whispered to Patch and the others as they ate the scraps he had brought. "But I won't stop coming." The creatures had grown thinner despite his efforts. Food was becoming scarce for them across the entire area. The terraforming process had eliminated most of their natural food sources, and without his supplements, many would starve. David had started bringing larger portions, even though it meant he ate less himself. A new sound echoed through the industrial zone that morning. Heavy machinery was moving nearby, getting closer each day. David climbed onto a pile of discarded metal to get a better view, and saw the construction crews working their way toward the Nubari's hiding places. Wilson wasn't just trying to stop the feeding. He was planning to demolish their entire habitat. This is about more than pest control, David realized aloud. The land was valuable, and Wilson wanted it cleared for development. The Nabari were just an inconvenience to be removed. That evening, David attended the weekly town meeting in the colony's main hall. He rarely spoke at these gatherings, but tonight felt different. He needed to understand Wilson's full plan and maybe find others who would support protecting the Nabari. The hall buzzed with conversation as colonists took their seats. David found a spot in the back corner where he could listen without drawing attention. Administrator Wilson stood at the front podium, his expression stern as always. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," Wilson announced, "I want to address the ongoing pest situation in Sector 7. Despite our clear regulations, someone continues to interfere with our control efforts." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. David felt his face grow warm as several people turned to look in his direction. Apparently his activities weren't as secret as he had hoped. Richard Stone, a successful businessman who owned several shops in the colony, stood up from his front row seat. "Administrator Wilson, perhaps it's time for stronger measures. These creatures multiply fast when they have reliable food sources. Someone is actively undermining our safety." "What do you suggest, Mr. Stone?" Wilson asked. Stone smiled coldly. "A bounty system. Pay colonists for every pest eliminated. Make it profitable to solve this problem permanently." Several people nodded in agreement. David felt sick listening to them discuss the Nabari like they were nothing more than insects to be exterminated. He thought about Patch's gentle purring and the way the creatures shared food with their young. "We could also increase penalties for feeding violations," added Dr. Sarah Wells, the colony's chief medical officer. "These animals could carry diseases that threaten human health. Anyone encouraging contact with them is putting us all at risk." David knew this was false. He had run basic health scans on the Nabari during his maintenance job days. and they carried no pathogens harmful to humans. But correcting Dr. Wells would only reveal that he had been studying the creatures more closely than anyone suspected. The bleeding hearts in this colony need to understand priorities, Stone continued, his voice growing louder. Human welfare comes first. We didn't travel across the galaxy to share our resources with vermin. More voices joined the conversation, each one more hostile toward the Nibari than the last. David listened to neighbors he had known for years dismiss the creatures as worthless pests that deserved elimination. The casual cruelty of it made his stomach turn. These aren't just animals, David said before he could stop himself. The room went quiet. Every head turned toward him. Wilson's eyes narrowed with interest. Mr. Reed, Wilson said with false politeness, would you like to share your expert opinion with the group? David stood up slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. I've observed them for months. They communicate with each other. They show care for their young. They have social structures and problem-solving abilities. These are signs of intelligence. Laughter broke out across the room. Richard Stone shook his head in mock sympathy. Poor David. Loses his job and now he thinks he's some kind of animal expert. Next, he'll be telling us they can do mathematics. You're anthropomorphizing simple survival behaviors, Dr. Wells added dismissively. Many species appear intelligent when observed casually. But true cognitive assessment requires proper scientific methodology. Then why not conduct proper studies instead of just assuming they're worthless? David asked. Wilson raised his hand for silence. Mr. Reed, your emotional attachment to these creatures is understandable but misguided. Colony resources must be allocated based on human needs, not sentimental feelings about local wildlife. What if I'm right? David pressed. What if we're destroying something important? Then you should have thought about that before you lost your position and credibility in this community, Stone said with a smirk. Face reality, David. You're a failed maintenance worker with too much time on his hands. Your opinion on xenobiology carries no weight here. The crowd murmured agreement. David felt his face burn with humiliation, but he couldn't back down now. The Nibari were here first. This was their home before we arrived. Don't we have some responsibility to coexist rather than eliminate? Coexistence is a luxury we can't afford, Wilson replied firmly. This colony operates on narrow margins. We cannot waste resources on creatures that provide no benefit to human welfare. Motion. To implement Mr. Stone's bounty proposal, called out someone from the middle of the room. Seconded, came another voice. Wilson nodded. All in favor of establishing a pest elimination bounty system? Hands rose throughout the hall. David counted them desperately, hoping to see opposition, but found almost none. The motion passed by an overwhelming margin. Motion approved, Wilson announced. Starting next week, the colony will pay 5 credits for each pest carcass delivered to security headquarters. Additionally, we're doubling fines for anyone caught feeding these creatures. David sank back into his chair as the meeting moved on to other topics. Around him, colonists chatted excitedly about the easy money they could make hunting Nibari. Someone behind him whispered that they had seen whole families of the creatures in the old processing plant. After the meeting ended, David walked home through empty streets. The bounty system would make the Nibari situation desperate. Colonists who had previously ignored them would now actively hunt them for profit. His food supplements wouldn't be enough to help them survive what was coming. Back in his apartment, David sat by his window and stared out at the industrial zone. Somewhere in that maze of abandoned buildings, Patch and the others were probably huddled together, unaware that their world was about to become much more dangerous. He had tried speaking up at the meeting and accomplished nothing except making himself a bigger target. The colony had made its choice. Profit and convenience mattered more than the lives of creatures they refused to understand. But David had made his choice too. Tomorrow morning he would return to the industrial zone with food scraps and whatever protection he could provide. If the colony wanted to mock him for showing compassion, so be it. Someone had to stand between the Nibari and extinction, even if that someone was just a failed maintenance worker with no credibility left to lose. The massive starship descended through New Terra's atmosphere like a silver mountain moving through clouds. David watched from his apartment window as the Trilonian diplomatic vessel settled onto the colony's main landing pad, with surprising grace for something so enormous. Purple and gold banners unfurled from its hull, displaying the royal symbols of the Trilonian Empire. For weeks, the entire colony had buzzed with preparation for this visit. Administrator Wilson had ordered fresh paint on every building, new uniforms for all security personnel, and the removal of anything that might suggest New Terra was anything less than a perfectly managed human settlement. The pest elimination bounty had doubled in the days leading up to the royal arrival. David pulled his worn jacket tighter and checked his makeshift feeding schedule. The increased hunting pressure meant he had to visit the Nibari more frequently, with smaller amounts of food to avoid detection. 3 of the creatures had already disappeared, and David tried not to think about what that meant. The industrial zone felt different when he arrived that morning. Several of the usual hiding spots showed signs of recent disturbance. Boot prints in the dirt, scattered debris, and the lingering smell of weapon discharge. The bounty hunters had been busy. "Patch," David called softly. "Are you there?" Silence answered him. David felt his heart sink as he searched through the familiar hiding places. Finally, a quiet chittering came from deep inside a damaged storage tank. Patch emerged slowly, followed by only one companion instead of the usual 3 or 4. "Where are the others?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. Patch made a series of low, mournful sounds that needed no translation. The remaining Nibari ate the food scraps with desperate hunger, their large eyes constantly scanning for threats. David had never seen them so frightened. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. David spun around to see 2 security officers heading his way. He quickly scattered the remaining food and tried to look casual, but it was too late. They had clearly seen what he was doing. "David Reed," the first officer said. "You're under arrest for violation of Colonial Regulation 47. Illegal feeding of restricted wildlife." David didn't resist as they placed restraint cuffs on his wrists. Patch and the other Nibari had already vanished into the depths of the storage tank. At least they would be safe for now. "Perfect timing," the second officer muttered. "Wilson wants this mess cleaned up before the Trilonians start their inspection tours." The Colonial Detention Center was a small but efficient building near the administration complex. David had never been inside before, though he had walked past it many times during his maintenance workdays. The holding cell was clean but Spartan, with a simple bench and basic facilities. Through the narrow window, David could see crowds gathering in the main plaza to catch a glimpse of the royal visitors. The Trilonians were an impressive species, tall and graceful with naturally purple-tinted skin and intricate silver markings that seemed to shift and change in the light. Their diplomatic reputation was legendary throughout the Federation. Administrator Wilson appeared outside David's cell that afternoon, his expression mixing anger with something that might have been concern. "This is your own fault. Reed," Wilson said through the security barrier. "I gave you every chance to stop this foolishness. Now you've forced my hand at the worst possible time." "The worst possible time for what?" David asked. "Showing basic compassion to starving creatures? The worst possible time for having a public trial about colony pest control policies, while Trilonian royalty evaluates our fitness for expanded Federation membership," Wilson snapped. "Do you have any idea what this visit means for our future?" David had heard the rumors. New Terra wanted advanced Federation status, which would bring increased trade opportunities, better technology access, and substantial economic benefits. The Trilonian Empire held significant influence in those decisions. "Maybe the Trilonians should know how we treat other species," David suggested. Wilson's face darkened. "The Trilonians will see a well-managed human colony that prioritizes efficiency and order. Your trial is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Plead guilty. Accept the fine and community service, and this can all be resolved quickly and quietly. And if I don't, then you face the full penalty under colonial law, up to 2 years imprisonment and permanent deportation. Think carefully about which future you prefer." After Wilson left, David sat on the narrow bench and considered his options. He could accept the plea agreement and return to his quiet life of secret feeding trips, or he could fight the charges and risk losing everything for principles that most people thought were foolish. Through his cell window, David watched the royal procession move through the colony's main district. Queen Salentha walked with regal bearing, flanked by her 2 daughters. The elder princess, Liara, moved with diplomatic precision, greeting colonists with practiced grace. But the younger princess, Nira, seemed more interested in studying the local environment than the ceremonial aspects of the visit. Princess Nira stopped frequently to examine plant life and take readings with various scientific instruments. David noticed that her path was slowly leading toward the industrial zone. A small hope began to grow in his chest. If she was a xenobiologist, she might understand what he had been trying to protect. Evening brought new sounds from outside the detention center. David could hear engines and machinery moving through the colony. Wilson was probably conducting his final cleanup operations, making sure nothing embarrassing remained visible for the royal inspection. Helen Cross appeared at his cell door with a food tray. She looked uncomfortable and kept glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed. "David," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know that some of us don't think you're wrong about those creatures." "Then why didn't anyone speak up at the town meeting?" Helen sighed. "Because jobs are hard to find out here, and Wilson remembers who supports him and who doesn't. Most people can't afford to take stands on principle." "But you can?" "I've been watching them too," Helen admitted. "The Nibari, you're right about their intelligence. I've seen them use tools and communicate in patterns. It's not just survival instinct." David felt a surge of validation. "Then you understand why I can't stop feeding them." "I understand. But understanding and being able to help are different things. My testimony might carry some weight in your trial, but it won't change the fundamental problem. Wilson wants them gone, and most colonists support him." After Helen left, David lay on the narrow bench and listened to the sounds of the colony settling into nighttime quiet. Somewhere out there, Patch and the few remaining Nibari were hiding in whatever safe spaces they could find. Tomorrow would bring his trial and possibly the end of any help he could provide them. But Princess Nira was still conducting her environmental survey. David closed his eyes and tried to sleep, holding on to the slim hope that someone with real authority might discover what he had been trying to protect all along. The Trilonians were known for their commitment to interspecies cooperation. If anyone could recognize the Nibari's true nature, it would be them. The question was whether that recognition would come in time to save the creatures from the bounty hunters and demolition crews that were closing in on their last refuges. David had done everything he could within his limited power. Now the fate of the Nibari might depend on forces beyond his control. The colony courthouse had never hosted such a distinguished audience. David sat at the defendant's table, acutely aware of the 3 Trilonian royals observing from the gallery's front row. Queen Selentha maintained perfect diplomatic composure, but her daughters whispered frequently to each other in their melodic native language. Judge Patricia Coleman called the court to order with more formality than David had ever seen in the usually casual colonial legal system. Administrator Wilson sat with the prosecution team, his expression confident. Beside David, court-appointed attorney Janet Mills shuffled through papers with the weary resignation of someone handling her 3rd case that week. The colony charges. David Reed with willful violation of Regulation 47, Prosecutor James Wright announced. Specifically, the illegal feeding of restricted wildlife in direct defiance of clear administrative orders. Wright was Wilson's cousin and rarely lost cases in the colonial courts. David had little hope that Janet Mills could mount an effective defense against him. "The defendant's actions may seem harmless to some," Wright continued, "but they represent a dangerous precedent. If colonists can simply ignore regulations they personally disagree with, we risk the breakdown of ordered society." David watched the jury as Wright spoke. 12 colonists selected from the general population, most of whom he recognized from town meetings where they had supported the bounty system. Their faces showed no sympathy for his situation. Furthermore, Wright said, the defendant's behavior has directly contributed to increased pest populations that threaten colonial resources and public health. His misguided sentimentality has made him an enemy of human welfare on New Terra. Princess Nira leaned forward slightly during this statement, her large violet eyes focused intently on the proceedings. David noticed she was taking notes on a small electronic device. "The prosecution will demonstrate that Mr. Reed knowingly and repeatedly violated clear regulations," Wright concluded. "We ask the court to impose the full penalty allowed under colonial law to send a message that such behavior will not be tolerated." Judge Coleman nodded and turned to the defense table. "Ms. Mills, your opening statement." Janet Mills stood up slowly, clearly unprepared for the scrutiny of royal observers. "Your Honor, my client acted from compassion rather than malice. David Reed saw suffering creatures and tried to help them. While his methods may have technically violated regulations, his intentions were humanitarian." David winced at the weak opening. Mills was essentially conceding guilt while asking for mercy based on good intentions. Against Wright's systematic prosecution, that approach would fail completely. Mr. Reed is a long-time colonist with no prior criminal record, Mills continued. He lost his job for refusing to participate in pest elimination programs, demonstrating consistent principles rather than sudden rebellious behavior. The prosecution's first witness was Richard Stone, who testified about seeing David near the industrial zone multiple times with food containers. Stone painted David as a dangerous eccentric whose actions threatened colonial stability. These creatures multiply rapidly when given reliable food sources, Stone explained. Mr. Reed's feeding program has made the pest problem significantly worse for all of us. In your opinion, what impact has the defendant's behavior had on the colony? Wright asked. It's undermined legitimate pest control efforts and encouraged these vermin to become more aggressive around human settlements. Some of them have been spotted near residential areas, which never happened before Reed started his feeding program. David knew this was a lie. The Nabari had always ranged throughout the colony area, but they avoided humans until the terraforming destroyed their natural food sources. Stone was twisting facts to support the prosecution's narrative. Dr. Sarah Wells testified next, describing the supposed health risks posed by increased human-wildlife contact. She spoke about potential disease transmission and aggressive behavior from animals that had lost their natural fear of humans. Animals that associate humans with food become dependent and unpredictable, Wells explained. Mr. Reed's actions have created a public health hazard that could have serious consequences. Princess Nira's note-taking became more rapid during Wells's testimony. Several times she exchanged meaningful glances with her sister princess, Liara. David wondered what they were thinking but couldn't interpret their expressions. Security Chief Frank Morrison described the enforcement challenges created by David's activities. We've had to divert significant resources to monitor the industrial zone and track down the source of illegal feeding. Those resources could have been used for legitimate security concerns. Has the defendant's behavior interfered with official pest control operations? Wright asked. Absolutely. Our elimination efforts work best when the target animals are hungry and desperate. Supplemental feeding makes them harder to trap and reduces the effectiveness of poison baits. David felt sick listening to Morrison describe the systematic extermination campaign as though it were routine maintenance work. The casual cruelty in the man's voice made it clear that he saw no difference between the Nabari and mechanical problems to be solved. When the prosecution rested its case, Judge Coleman called a brief recess. During the break, David noticed Princess Nira speaking urgently with Queen Salentha. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their body language suggested significant concern. Ms. Mills, Judge Coleman said when court resumed. Call your first witness, on your honor. The defense calls David Reed. David took the witness stand knowing that his testimony was probably his only chance to explain his actions. Mills asked basic questions about his background and motivations, but her inexperience showed in her failure to challenge the prosecution's key claims. Mr. Reed, why did you continue feeding these animals after regulations prohibited it? Mills asked. Because they were starving, David replied simply. We destroyed their natural food sources when we terraformed this area. They had nowhere else to turn. But surely you understood that you were breaking colonial law. David hesitated, knowing that his answer could determine his sentence. I understood that following the law would mean watching innocent creatures suffer and die. I couldn't do that. Mr. Reed, Wright said during cross-examination, do you consider yourself above colonial authority? No. But I don't think authority gives us the right to cause unnecessary suffering. Are you a trained xenobiologist, Mr. Reed? No. Are you qualified to assess the intelligence or ecological impact of alien species? I don't need formal training to recognize intelligence when I see it. Wright smiled coldly. So your violation of colonial law was based entirely on personal opinion and emotional reaction, rather than scientific evidence or legal authority? It was based on observation and conscience. Observation by an untrained maintenance worker and conscience that prioritizes animal welfare over human community welfare. David felt the trap closing around him. I don't see those as conflicting priorities. Mr. Reed, do you believe colonial regulations should be optional for citizens who personally disagree with them? I believe people have a responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves, even when authorities forbid it. Wright's expression showed satisfaction with that answer. David realized he had just confessed to placing personal judgment above legal authority, which would strengthen the prosecution's case for maximum penalties. As David returned to his seat, he caught Princess Nira's eye. She was studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment he thought he saw something like approval in her violet gaze. "The defense rests," Mills announced weakly. Judge Coleman nodded. "We'll break for lunch and reconvene for closing arguments in 2 hours." David spent the break in his holding cell, eating a sandwich and trying not to think about his probable future. Through the small window he could see workers preparing for the royal banquet that evening. The timing was perfect for Wilson to showcase a smooth, efficient legal system that dealt swiftly with troublemakers. But something in Princess Nira's intense attention suggested that the trial's outcome might not be as predetermined as everyone assumed. David clung to that small hope as he prepared to hear his fate decided by a jury that had already made up their minds. The afternoon session began with an unexpected interruption. As Prosecutor Wright prepared to deliver his closing argument, Princess Nira stood gracefully in the gallery. "Your Honor," she said in accented but perfect human standard, "I request permission to address the court." Judge Coleman looked startled. She glanced toward Administrator Wilson, who appeared equally confused by this breach of protocol. "Your Highness, this is a colonial legal proceeding. I'm not certain what role Trelonian observers would have in our judicial process." Queen Salentha rose beside her daughter. "Judge Coleman, Princess Nira holds credentials as a certified xenobiologist with the Federation Science Council. If she has relevant expert testimony to offer, Federation law permits her participation in cases involving interspecies matters." Wilson's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected the trial to become an interspecies matter. "Your Honor, this case involves simple violation of colonial regulations, not interspecies relations." "That determination may be premature," Princess Layara added, also standing. "If my sister's scientific findings are correct, this case involves significantly more complex legal questions than initially apparent." David felt his heart racing. Whatever Princess Nira had discovered during her environmental survey was apparently relevant to his situation. He saw Janet Mills looking equally confused but hopeful. Judge Coleman considered her options carefully. Denying a Federation expert the right to testify could create diplomatic problems, but allowing it might complicate what Wilson wanted to be a simple local matter. "I'll permit expert testimony from Princess Nira," Coleman decided. "However, it must be directly relevant to the charges against Mr. Reed." Princess Nira approached the witness stand with scientific equipment David didn't recognize. She activated a holographic display that showed detailed biological data. "Your Honor, during my survey of this colony's ecosystem, I conducted comprehensive analysis of the local fauna," Nira began. "The creatures that have been referred to as pests throughout this trial display characteristics that fundamentally change the legal context of Mr. Reed's actions." Wright objected immediately. "Your Honor, the defendant's trial concerns violation of colonial regulations, not biological classifications." "The two are inseparable in this case," Nira replied calmly. "Federation law provides specific protections for sapient species, regardless of local regulations." A murmur ran through the courtroom. David felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Could Princess Nira be suggesting what he thought she was? "The biological data I collected shows that these creatures, which I believe should be designated Nibbereth rather than the dismissive term Nibberi, possess complex neural structures consistent with sapient intelligence," Nira continued. Her holographic display showed brain scans and behavioral analysis charts. They demonstrate tool use, symbolic communication, cooperative problem solving, and abstract reasoning. These are not simple animals acting on instinct. They are a previously unrecognized sapient species. The courtroom erupted in shocked conversation. Judge Coleman banged her gavel for order while Wilson's face cycled through various shades of red and purple. Furthermore, Nira continued once quiet was restored, "My analysis indicates that this species' traditional food sources were systematically eliminated during the terraforming process. Mr. Reed's feeding activities weren't encouraging pest behavior. They were preventing genocide of a sapient population." Wright leaped to his feet. "Objection! These are extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. One expert's opinion cannot overturn established colonial policies. Princess Liara approached the witness stand. Your Honor, I would like to present additional context. As Trilonian diplomatic representative to the Federation Council, I can confirm that systematic elimination of sapient species constitutes a Class 1 violation of Federation law, regardless of whether the perpetrating colony recognized their sapient status. David watched Wilson's confident expression crumble as the legal implications became clear. If the Nibiruth were indeed sapient, then the bounty system and elimination programs violated major Federation statutes. New Terra's application for advanced Federation status would be not only denied, but could result in serious legal consequences. Princess Nira, Judge Coleman said carefully, what evidence supports your classification of these creatures as sapient? I documented their use of modified tools to extract food from human waste containers, Nira replied, displaying video footage. I recorded over 40 distinct vocalizations that follow grammatical patterns suggesting complex language. I observed cooperative behaviors including strategic food sharing, coordinated childcare, and collective problem-solving. The footage showed Nibiruth using small sticks to reach food scraps in containers too deep for their paws. It showed them communicating in what were clearly structured conversations. It showed adult Nibiruth teaching young ones how to identify safe hiding spots and edible plants. Most significantly, Nira continued, I identified genetic markers indicating that this species possesses the neurological structures necessary for interspecies empathy recognition. They are naturally equipped to form emotional bonds with other sapient species, including humans. David's breath caught. The connection he had felt with Patch and the others wasn't just his imagination. The Nibiruth were literally designed to understand and empathize with other intelligent beings. This explains Mr. Reed's intuitive recognition of their nature, Nira said, looking directly at David. Humans possess compatible genetic markers for interspecies. Empathy, Mr. Reed's compassionate response to these creatures represents successful interspecies communication at its most fundamental level. Wright made several more objections, but Judge Coleman overruled them. The scientific evidence was compelling, and the legal implications were becoming unavoidable. Princess Liara, Coleman said, what would Federation law require if Princess Nira's classification is accepted? Immediate cessation of all hostile activities against the Nibiruth population, Liara replied formally. Recognition of their territorial rights to traditional habitats. Establishment of formal diplomatic contact protocols. And investigation of any individuals or organizations that knowingly participated in sapient rights violations. Wilson finally found his voice. Your Honors, this is an internal colonial matter. We cannot allow foreign interference in our domestic policies. Queen Salentha spoke for the first time during the proceedings. Administrator Wilson, Federation membership requires adherence to Federation law. You cannot claim colonial autonomy while simultaneously seeking advanced Federation status. Furthermore, Princess Liara added, Mr. Reed's actions weren't criminal violations. They were humanitarian interventions to protect a vulnerable sapient population. Under Federation law, he should be commended rather than prosecuted. David felt tears welling in his eyes. For months, he had been mocked and dismissed for recognizing what now seemed obvious. The Nibiruth weren't pests to be eliminated. They were people to be protected, Your Honor, Janet Mills said, finally finding her voice. I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. Judge Coleman looked overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of a simple regulatory case into a complex interspecies rights matter. She glanced toward Wilson, who was frantically whispering with Wright. This court is recessed until tomorrow morning, Coleman announced. I need time to review Federation legal precedents and consult with appropriate authorities. As the courtroom emptied, Princess Nira approached David at the defendant's table. Mr. Reed, I want you to know that your compassion prevented a tragedy. Without your intervention, the Nibiruth population would have starved before anyone recognized their sapience. Thank you, David managed to say. I just knew they were special. Indeed they are, Nira smiled. And so are humans who can recognize personhood across species barriers. That empathy may be humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. David was escorted back to his holding cell, but for the first time in months, he felt hopeful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight he could rest knowing that Patch and the other Nibereth would finally receive the recognition and protection they deserved. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Judge Coleman returned to her bench. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with colonists, Trilonian observers, and Federation officials who had arrived overnight via emergency transport. David sat at the defendant's table, no longer feeling like a criminal but not yet certain of his freedom. After extensive consultation with Federation legal advisors, Judge Coleman began, "This court officially recognizes the scientific findings presented by Princess Nira. The creatures previously classified as pests are hereby acknowledged as the Nibereth, a sapient species deserving full protection under Federation law." Cheers erupted from several sections of the gallery, though David noticed Administrator Wilson and his supporters remained grimly silent. Accordingly, all charges against David Reed are dismissed with prejudice, Coleman continued. Furthermore, this court finds that Mr. Reed's actions constituted legitimate humanitarian aid to a vulnerable sapient population. David felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. Janet Mills patted his arm with genuine satisfaction, probably her first major courtroom victory in years. However, Coleman said, her expression becoming stern, this court must also address the broader implications of recent colonial policies regarding the Nibereth. Administrator Wilson looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The past 24 hours had transformed him from a confident administrator into a man facing potential criminal charges. Based on Federation legal review, the bounty system established by colonial administration constitutes attempted genocide of a sapient species, Coleman announced. Effective immediately, all bounty payments are suspended and must be returned to colonial funds. Richard Stone stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, we acted based on the best information available at the time. No one could have known these creatures were intelligent. Princess Nira rose gracefully from her seat. Mr. Stone, Mr. Reed recognized their sapience based on careful observation over several months. The information was available to anyone willing to look beyond their preconceptions. One man's opinion hardly constitutes scientific consensus, Stone protested. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the courtroom, multiple people noticed unusual behaviors but were discouraged from reporting them. David turned to see Helen Cross walking forward. She wore her security uniform but carried herself with newfound confidence. Officer Cross, Judge Coleman said, do you have relevant testimony for this court? Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed the Nibereth using tools and displaying cooperative behaviors consistent with Princess Nira's findings. When I mentioned these observations to Administrator Wilson, I was told to focus on my assigned duties rather than amateur animal psychology. Wilson's face darkened. Officer Cross, you're out of line. Your job is enforcement, not biological assessment. My job is protecting the colony, Helen replied firmly. That includes protecting sapient beings from harm, regardless of species. Queen Salentha stood with royal dignity. Judge Coleman, the Trilonian Empire formally recognizes the Nibereth as a sovereign sapient species. We offer to mediate establishment of diplomatic relations between New Terra Colony and the Nibereth community. Additionally, Princess Liara added, the Federation Council has authorized me to negotiate territorial agreements that respect Nibereth traditional habitats while maintaining human settlement rights. David marveled at how quickly everything was changing. Yesterday he was a criminal facing deportation. Today he was surrounded by officials discussing interspecies diplomacy. Mr. Reed, Coleman said, given your unique experience with the Nibereth, would you be willing to serve as temporary human liaison during the establishment of formal relations? David blinked in surprise. I'm not sure I'm qualified for diplomatic work, Your Honor. You're the most qualified person on this planet, Princess Nira said with a smile. You recognized their personhood when no one else would. You risked your freedom to protect them. Who better to help build trust between our species? But I'm just a maintenance worker, David protested. Queen Salentha approached the witness stand where David still sat. Mr. Reed, titles and credentials matter less than character. You demonstrated the courage to stand alone for what you believed was right. That is precisely the quality needed for successful interspecies relations. The Nibereth trust you, Princess Nira added. After months of persecution, that trust is invaluable for establishing peaceful contact. David thought about Patch and the others hiding in the industrial zone. They had accepted him when his own species rejected him. Maybe he could help bridge the gap between worlds. I accept, David said quietly. Administrator Wilson finally spoke up. Your Honor, while I appreciate the need for diplomatic protocols, this colony still has practical concerns. How do we balance Nibereth territorial rights with human development needs? Carefully and with mutual respect, Queen Selentha replied. The Trilonian Empire has extensive experience with multi-species colonies. We would be honored to share that expertise with New Terra. Furthermore, Princess Liara said, preliminary assessment suggests the Nibereth possess advanced understanding of sustainable ecosystem management. Their knowledge could greatly benefit human agricultural and terraforming efforts. David remembered how the Nibereth had carefully shared resources and maintained their environment, even while under constant threat. They might have solutions to problems the colony hadn't even recognized yet. This court orders the immediate establishment of a joint species commission, Coleman announced. Mr. Reed will serve as human Nibereth liaison under Federation oversight. Administrator Wilson will coordinate colonial compliance with new diplomatic protocols. Wilson nodded reluctantly, clearly understanding that his future depended on successful cooperation with the new arrangements. What about reparations for the Nibereth who were killed during the bounty period? Asked Dr. Wells, who had apparently switched sides now that the political winds had changed. Princess Nira's expression grew sad. The Federation will provide standard genocide reparations, including territorial restoration and cultural preservation support. Unfortunately, individual lives cannot be restored. David felt a pang of grief for the creatures who hadn't survived long enough to see this recognition. But their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless if it led to protection for the survivors. As the formal session ended, David found himself surrounded by well-wishers and officials eager to discuss the new arrangements. Through the crowd, he caught sight of Princess Nira preparing to leave. Princess, David called out, thank you for everything. I know you saved more than just my life today. Actually, Mr. Reed, I believe you saved mine, Nira replied with a gentle smile. You reminded me why I became a scientist in the first place, to understand and protect the universe's incredible diversity of life. What happens now? David asked. Now you help two species learn to live together as neighbors instead of strangers, Queen Selentha said, joining their conversation. It won't be easy, but the foundation you build through simple compassion will make it possible. 3 weeks later, David stood in the same industrial zone where he had once hidden from security patrols. But now the area bustled with activity as human engineers worked alongside Nibereth environmental specialists to design sustainable habitats for both species. Patch approached him carrying a small tool that the Nibereth had crafted for soil analysis. The creature's communication device, provided by Trilonian technology, allowed for basic translation. Friend David, the device said in mechanical tones that couldn't quite capture Patch's warm chittering. New seedlings grow well in restored soil. Both species will eat from this ground. David scratched behind Patch's ears, earning the familiar purring sound. Together we can make this work. In the distance, children from the colony school were arriving for their first official lesson in Nibereth culture and ecology. Dr. Wells, now serving as educational coordinator, guided them toward a group of young Nibereth who would serve as their guides. Richard Stone had quietly left the colony rather than face continued scrutiny of his role in the bounty system. Administrator Wilson remained in his position, but under close Federation oversight. Helen Cross had been promoted to Chief of Interspecies Security. David's official title was Human Nibereth Cultural Liaison, though most people just called him the Bridge Builder. He had never been happier in his life. Every day brought new discoveries about Nibereth society and new opportunities to help two very different species understand each other. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, David walked home, through streets where human and Nibereth children played together in carefully designed common areas. Princess Nira had been right about humanity's gift for interspecies empathy. It just took the right circumstances to bring it out. The transformation hadn't been easy or complete. Some colonists still harbored resentment about the changes, and some Nibereth remained suspicious of human intentions. But progress was being made one relationship at a time, built on the foundation of simple compassion that had started with one man feeding strays. David smiled as he reached his apartment, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that understanding between species wasn't just possible, but essential for building a better galaxy.